Hello everyone, it's Elizabeth from the Smart Stitcher. In this week's tutorial we are going to be showing you how to sew your moccasin slipper together. So we're going to be using the stitches with the baseball stitch for our back seam, and we're also going to be using our oversewing and our whipped oversewing for our attaching our upper to our base. So let's get underway. Before we start any sewing, we just need to check that the sole has actually stuck down properly and that there aren't any gaps between the leather and the sole itself. Now I can just see that in there a couple of places there's a little bit of a gap, and what I'm going to do before I start sewing is I'm going to double check that I'm happy with everything else, and I'm just going to re-glue some of these areas where the very edge has just popped a little bit. So I'm going to get that done, and that can be drying whilst the back of the seam and we're working on the upper basically. So just quickly double check if there's anything which runs the risk of it catching. You want to make sure that that's re-glued and weighted down so that there is no gap between your sole and the sole of the actual leather as well. Once we have checked our sole and we've applied glue to any areas that looked a bit loose, we are then going to be working on the back seam of the upper. So this is the seam that will rest against your ankle, and we're going to be using baseball stitch for this because that gives us a nice seam that butts our two edges of our leather together, and that will sit nice and flat against our heel. Now what we didn't do, and what we don't want to do, is we didn't want to trim any of the fur on this edge because we want that nice and bushy. So I didn't deliberately trim that one, but we did trim the upper and the moccasin sole as well to reduce some of the bulk when we're hand sewing. So the first thing to do is to get our upper nice and level, and I've just pinned it for the moment with my clips, and the next thing I'm going to do is to tack it with a needle and thread, and basically that just allows me to get rid of the clips. It holds the edge nice and level, and it stops the leather from sliding as I'm sewing along. So I'm not going to go right to the edge, but I'm going to go a little bit in from that so I can hold that nice and firmly when I start sewing. You can do your choice of knots here, so I've got a betweens number 10 needle and just an ordinary polyester sewing thread that I'm now going to knot. Pull that nice and tight, but if you've pulled it really tight and you pull it out of the leather, that's not good. And then I'm going to cut off the ends. So your stitch needs to be nice and firm, but not in any way, shape or form damaging the leather. So I'm probably going to put my tacking stitches maybe every 5 to 6 centimeters, just so that I can get rid of the clips, because I always find that my thread whips around them. So I'm just going to keep doing that now, tying my knots nice and securely, and then removing the clips as I go. So I've now got the back of my moccasin nice and tacked, and I'm just going to pop that to one side for a moment. Baseball stitch is the stitch we're using, and this allows the edges of the leather to butt up against each other. We are starting and finishing our stitches in a very similar way to that which we would do with our whipped oversewing, and we are doing 3 stitches at the bottom, 3 stitches at the top, and that will be enough to finish our thread. With baseball stitch, and I've got my little diagram here which I'll zoom in just to give you a bit more detail on. It's about where you bring your needle out and where you tuck your needle in. So I'm going to be folding my leather in half, and I'm going to be coming from the back to the front to do my 3 stitches. So I'm basically going in at number 1 and I'm coming out at number 2. I'm then going to take my thread over and I'm going to tuck under the right hand side and come out at number 3, and then take my thread out, come over, tuck under the left hand side of leather for number 4. And I'm going to repeat that process of coming out and tucking under the opposite piece of leather all the way up, and then when I get to my finish point I will finish with just those 3 stitches to hold the leather and hold the stitch in place, and that is job done. I've deliberately used a contrasting thread with this sample so that you can easily see the stitches and you know what they're going to look like. For the purposes of sewing my moccasin here, I'm actually using a thread that is a very similar colour to the leather. So You can do a contrast, you can do whatever colour you like. If you want something that stands out, then you go for a contrast. If you want it to blend in, then you go for something that matches the colour of your leather. So I'm going to start off at the base. So this is where the sole would join, and I'm going to work my way up to the top. So I've got my leather, I'm going to use my fingers just to sort of pinch, and again I'm sort of starting probably 3 or 4 mils up from the base and sort of 3 or 4 mils out from the edge. So 3 or 4 mils up that way and then coming across this way, and I'm going to come from back to front, leave a tail that I can see and I can grip if it starts disappearing. So I'm going to do those 3 stitches, one on top of the other in the same spot, and then I'm going to start my baseball stitch. When you're doing your stitches, you want to make sure that you don't catch underneath, that your loop is always over that sort of side of the leather there. So just one more to do. Sometimes I kind of go either side of the tail just to kind of make sure that I've caught everything in, and just to give a bit more reinforcement to the tail, like so. And I'm going to cut that off because that will get in the way as we are sewing. So we're now going to start our baseball stitch. So my thread has come out here at number 2. I'm now going to tuck in and come under and come out for number 3. Now I find it easier, and I've mentioned this in my stitching how-to video, to sort of turn it upside down. So if I'm going from left to right, I find it easier to come upside down, and I'm probably no more than about 4 millimeters away from that first stitch, similar distance away from the edge, and I'm going to make my stitch. When I go from right to left, I find it easier to look at it from this way. So each time you're making your stitch, you want to keep the similar distance and similar width from the edge as the previous stitch that you've just made. So just use that last stitch as a bit of a reference. It can, with baseball stitch, be really easy to creep and for the gap to get bigger as you go along your sewing. So try and resist the urge to do that. And we're going to be pulling it tight as we go along. I'm always pulling my thread in the direction which I'm going. And if my leather is starting to wrinkle, then I know that I've started to pull everything too tight. But it's one of those stitches where you find that the stitch that you've just pulled tight perhaps actually pulls the previous 2 or 3 stitches better, and then it sort of works its way along. So I'm gonna just keep going, keep turning that through, and all I'm going to be doing is just working my way up now to the top of the moccasin, just like we did in the sample. Keep going with the stitch, and then we will do our finishing stitches. So again, key tip is to make sure that you're always keeping a nice even gap between your stitches, so that there's always a sort of a similar distance, and that will help them stay consistent to get a nice even finish on your sewing. Here we have our completed seams. This is our back seam completed with our baseball stitch. To finish it off, what I'm going to do is just to gently hammer it. So I've got a shoemaker's last here, which is quite handy for this sort of thing, and I'm just going to slide the baseball seam over that. I'm just going to zoom out a little bit as well to make it easier for you to see. And what I'm going to do is just very, very gently hammer the stitches. So I'm not looking to thrash them, but I am looking to help them settle and help them to flatten out. So if you're worried about damaging the leather, you can at this particular point always use an offcut and just hammer through that. And we're just literally hammering along the length of the seam so that the starting and finishing stitches in particular lie nice and flat. There we go. So that's just settled it out nicely, and that is now ready to be attached to our upper. Once we've hammered the back seam, we're actually going to turn our upper inside out, so we've got the furry side facing us, and this is where our markings on our patterns are going to start to come into their own, because with the moccasin inside out, I'm now going to start matching up my markings. So the center front markings around by the toes, they'll match up. The marking where we are coming sort of around the corner and off the big toe will match up, as will these two here. And then when we get to the base, the center marking where the back seam is joined together will match up to our center marking on the heel here. What you will find is that the markings where we've got to just sort of start our straight edges, sort of here and just up here, once we've got these 3 points tacked in position up here and these points, or certainly this point here, tacked into position, we'll then be able to sort of work out where our straight edges will actually sit and sort of get everything tacked together. So let me show you what that's going to look like. So with my clips, I'm now looking to match up my markings. So I'm just leveling the marking, have a quick check, and then I'm clipping it into position. So I'm doing the toe section first, and if your markings happen to have kind of rubbed off, you can just very lightly pop your pattern back on top, as you just want to get a sense of where those markings are, so you can just repen them in quite quickly. So I'm just leveling everything up, just checking that I'm happy with that position, and then I can see now where my excess is going to be taken in. I'm now going to come down and pin the back of the moccasin to the sole at the back, and we're going to clip that together. Now I know that my sides are straight, and I know that at this particular marking point here that things are going to start to curve. So as I straighten this edge and I'm just leveling the edges and clipping them, I'm just going to sort of walk everything down so that I walk towards that marking. So that's nice and level, nice and straight, and clipped together. And then eventually I will get to that particular marking. So I know that on the sides there aren't going to be any puckers. It's just on the heel and the toe sections. So I've now walked down to that last point there, and I'm going to just add an extra clip there. So I know that there's a little bit here that I will need to tuck into my puckers, and then exactly the same on the other side. So this is the toe end at the moment, so I'm just going to level the edges. Sometimes when you put the sole on, the leather will just kind of wrinkle a little bit. Just try and sort of just very carefully sort of piece that together so that there is no kind of wrinkle on the side of the foot, and you're going to work your way along down to that marker on the other side. So I'm probably putting a few more clips in than I need, but it just means that I can keep an eye on everything and make sure that, there we go, there's my marker, so I can get down to the right point. And then I personally find it much easier to tack everything into position, and the tacking will be just like we did on the upper before we did our baseball seam. It's basically just to hold everything in place. So I know that on my straight sides there are no puckers, but around my heel and my toe there are. So my next step now is to tack all of those into position. Right, we're all tacked. I've replaced all of the clips with tacking stitches and we're ready to start sewing. If you are worried about dealing with the excess around the toe or the heel areas, you could add an additional tacking stitch. And what I mean by that is I'm going to sort of estimate roughly where the halfway point is for my toe excess, and I could measure that as well. And I'm just going to, I could, if I wanted to, pop another sort of tacking stitch in which sort of divides up the toe excess a little bit more. That you may find that a bit easier if you're a bit worried about getting rid of the excess. Basically, I'm now going to start sewing at the toe. I'm going to work out to the left, to the right, or to the right and then to the left. It doesn't matter which one you do. And then I'm going to do exactly the same as at the heel, working out to the left and right, or vice versa. And then once I have come around those toe areas, I'm just going to work my way down the side on that straight edge. So let's get underway. So with our sewing, I'm starting at the sort of central sort of tacking stitch by the toe, and I'm doing 3 stitches to just start me off, one on top of the other. And we're using a whipped oversewing stitch to sew the moccasin together, and I want to make sure that I've got that thread nice and secure, and then I'm going to cut off my excess. Now, the nature of the design we've got here, we're not puckering every stitch, but it will be alternate stitches. So I'm going to make sure I hold the work, and I want to start off, I'm going to start just by doing a flat stitch, and I'm going really no more than say 3 or 4 mils into my leather. So I'm not stitching all the way down here, I'm making sure that I am stitching probably just where I've trimmed the fur. So I'm going to do my first stitch, it's probably actually nearer 3 mils, it's not very deep. So first stitch, and we oversew twice in the same place. If you can, in the same holes or next to the holes, wherever's easier. So I've done my first stitch. I'm now going to work my way along. I'm going to do a very tiny pucker, so these are very small, and I'm going to do that twice. So this is where our sort of whipped effect comes in. So the puckers are very small, but we do want to sort of get a nice balance around the toe here. So now it's my straight stitch, and I'm just going to keep working my way around. My stitches probably 3 to 4 millimeters apart, maybe slightly more, but not massive distances, because we don't want to have a hole when we turn out the moccasin the right way. So I'm just going to create my little puckers. I'm going to oversew them and just make sure that they are in the right position as I pull the thread tight, and then I'll know that I can carry on working my way around. And that's all I'm going to do now. Keep working, alternating pucker, no pucker, and if I find that I have run out of leather to pucker, then that's absolutely fine. I just carry on doing the straight edge. So I've now got my toe, my sort of big toe area, and that's all stitched in, and I'm working my way down the side for a little bit more. Now I've just taken out that first tacking stitch, and I'm just keeping an eye on the direction of my tacking stitches here, because if I start to drag the leather one way or another, the tacking stitch will go at a slight angle. So I want to keep my tacking stitch at sort of going across the seam, and if it's diagonal, I'll know that I'm starting to drag. I've got my thumb and my index finger of my non-sewing hand, and I'm just using that to sort of almost expose the edges of the leather that I want to sew and sort of keep some of the fur out of the way. Now remember, we have trimmed this, but obviously there is still a bit of fur there, so it can be quite useful just to sort of push that down with your between your thumb and your index finger and make it easier, or might make it slightly easier to sew. Also, by keeping my thumb, my index finger in that position, and by smoothing out the fur, I can also get a really good sense of the depth that I'm going with my needle. So I can actually just use my index finger as a little bit of a guide, and my thumbnail on the other side. I'm not stabbing myself, but they are there just kind of helping me gauge the depth as well. So that's a useful little tip to help you as you sew your moccasins. So I've come around the toe, and I've stopped probably just around the sort of the widest part of the foot where I've got a tacking stitch there, because I'm now going to come back up to the top, grab my next needle and thread, and I'm still using the Gutterman's Mara thread and a Betweens number 5 needle, just because that goes through the skin really nicely. This time though, I'm going to take my tacking stitch out. My other thread, you'll be able to see, is just hanging there at the moment, so I'm just going to keep that to one side and out of the way. And I'm going to start off at the top again. Again, I'm wanting to expose just the bit that I want to stitch. I'm going to start off by using my 3 stitches, so I'm just a short distance away from where I started my very first thread off, and then I'm just going to do my 3 stitches now, and we're going to do exactly the same pattern of 1 pucker, 1 straight stitch, as I then come out around the toes round to the outside of the foot. So just get the 3 stitches in, check that that's not going anywhere, that's good. Trim off the tail, and I'm then going to again get my thumb and my index finger in position, and we're going to start off with a straight stitch, and then we'll do start to include our puckers. So I just want to check everything is nice and level, just like we did before, going through the leather. I might actually add an extra stitch because that stitch didn't feel like it went through. That's good. So sometimes if it feels like it perhaps went through a little bit too shallow and too near the edge, just put an extra stitch in to hold it. So now we're going to just start, and I can just use the needle, pull the fur a little bit to create a nice small pucker, and I'm going to stitch that in position. So a little tip as you are doing your puckers is to watch where your thread sits, so to help keep the pucker in position. So on here I've pulled that up, and I'm now going to stitch it. Oh, that's quite a big pucker. Let's make that a little bit smaller. I don't want a massive one. Smaller ones I'm going to give you a much smoother shape. If you do large puckers, it will look really lumpy and uneven, and we want to avoid that. So I'm just going to put a little one in, and I'm going to do my 2 stitches. So as I'm working my way around, I've got my pucker on the right hand side, and I want my thread to sit on the left hand side, and that will help to keep it into position. So I'll just do that a second time, and then we're going to move on to our straight stitch. Again, just keeping the fur out of the way. We've started at the toe, I've gone out to the right, out to the left, and they are now sewn in place, and I've stopped just for the moment where the moccasin starts to straighten up on that straight edge there. I've left my needles attached because I will be carrying on stitching with them shortly. I'm now going to turn my attention to the heel, and I'm going to do the same again, although there perhaps won't be the same amount of puckering as there was around the toe, but I still want to get a nice even finish. So I'm going to start at the centre back seam with my tacking stitch, next to my tacking stitch, and then I am going to work my way round to the right. Now I know when I did the back seam here that I didn't trim that one because of the baseball stitch, so now I'm just going to take a moment to get my edges nice and level, check the angle of my tacking stitch, and then I am going to start. So I will start just next to that tacking stitch, just a quick double check. This is where you could almost do with an extra pair of hands. And again, if you were worried about getting the excess in, you could sort of measure the halfway point between the upper and the sole and mark it with a tacking stitch. So there we go. So let's pull that through. So starting off in exactly the same way, I'll do my 3 starting stitches. I'm then going to just do the straight stitch with no pucker, and then I'm going to, after that, I will start the puckering. I will take the tacking stitch out when I get to sew towards the left in a short moment. So I've done my starting stitches. I think I managed to catch in my tail there as well. So again, I'm just going to make sure that my fur is out the way, and I'm going to start off with my straight stitch, and then I'm going to add my first pucker just like we've done before, and I'll keep going all the way around the heel until the side of the foot starts to straighten up. So it's exactly the same as what we did earlier on, and the puckers you might find at the heel end are a little bit sort of smaller again than those at the toe. So let's just start that off. So I can make sure my previous stitch is nice and tight, and again I did mention about using the position of your thread loops to help your stitching, so that I know that when I pull my loop nice and tight, I've made my stitch. Oh, that's a very small pucker there, but the pucker will be here, and when I'm going to the right, the loop will be on the right, and it'll be vice versa on the left hand side. So I'm just now going to work my way around just like we've done before, straight stitch, pucker stitch, and onto the side of the foot then. At this point we are well underway and almost there. I have now come round the outside of the heel, and I've just stopped at the tacking stitch where I know that the side of the foot is really straight. The next thing to do is to come back, and I'm going to start at the centre of the heel again, work my way around, and I'm coming up the inside of the foot this time. I will remove that tacking stitch because I no longer need it as a marker because I've already stitched that area down. And then we are going to use our final thread, which is all waxed and ready to go, and we're going to start sewing. So exactly the same procedure again. I didn't find that I had too many puckers actually. I only had a very small handful in my sort of first inch and a bit, so there may not be as many on that sort of heel area, but just keep an eye on it as you're working your way around. So I'm now going to do my starting stitches, hopefully without making my tail disappear this time, and we're going to continue exactly the same pattern for this final section that we started with, and that's our sort of straight stitch and then our pucker stitch. So that's nice and secure. I can get rid of the tail, and then off we go. So straight stitch, pucker stitch, just like we've done before. I've now come round the inside of my heel, coming up the inside of the foot. I found I did have a few more puckers on that side than I did on the other side. What's important is the centre back seam matches up, and which is why we've sort of added the markings on the pattern to help balance everything out. So I know that I'm going to always be in the correct proportion. So I've now got my 4 threads, and basically I'm going to bring those from the heel towards the middle, those from the toe also down towards the middle, and then where they meet is where I'm going to finish them off and make sure that my threads are nice and secure before we do anything else. Now I'm ready to finish off my seam. This is just on the outside of the foot, and I've continued my stitch pattern, and my threads are now sort of fairly close to each other. I just sort of tip that, you can see they're sort of quite close, almost a stitch width apart there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm not going to sort of go over the other thread, but I am going to go quite close to it, and I'm just going to do 3 stitches in the same place to finish the thread off, just like we did at the start, and then I will repeat that with the other thread, and then I can cut them both off. So my first one is just about done. I'm going to pull it nice and tight and cut as close as I can down to the leather, like so. I'm then going to finish off the second thread, and again I want to make sure that as I'm finishing that there is no hole in the seam, so I'm making sure that my stitches are nice and close together. So I'm going to do one more for luck, and then snip that off. So that is one side now completely done, and then I'm going to do exactly the same on the inside of the foot, bring these 2 threads together and then finish them off. I'm just about to finish my final thread off. If you realise that you are starting to run out of thread or your thread snaps, you can just do your 3 stitches with as much thread as you've got, or use a lasso to pull the end through. And sometimes I've found if I've come down from the toe, I've not had enough thread, so if I've got a little bit of a longer length coming up from the heel, then I've just extended that up, and sort of vice versa as well. And always sort of, as long as you've got enough thread to do your finishing stitches, you are absolutely fine. So sometimes you just have to adapt the technique based on what you are sort of seeing. I think I've done plenty of finishing stitches there. Now the next thing to just have a quick look at is just a sort of a visual check, to check that everything is even, that everything is nice and fine. Now I spotted earlier as I was coming around the toe that I've actually got a thread loop here. There is a loop of thread. Now this loop of thread was caught around some of the fur on the moccasin sole. Now naturally I don't want a sort of a loop on the inside, because that means that I'm going to have a loose stitch somewhere around this particular part, and I don't want that. So one or two of the threads that I finished earlier, I'm actually going to use that now to secure this particular loop. And all I'm going to do is just to pull back the fur a little bit to probably a couple of stitches either side of that loop, and I'm going to just go through the seam again, through the same holes, or I'm actually just a little bit further up, closer to the edge, but I want to sort of give myself the best chance of going through the holes if I can. So I'm going to do my 3 stitches. I'm then going to basically follow the pattern of the puckers and the loops, doing my 2 stitches each time so that I can then get rid of this loop. So if you find that there's any areas of uneven stitching, just come back over them and secure them with another thread, and I'm going to keep that loop up in the air, because what I'm then going to do is to cut off my loop. So I've now done a couple of stitches either side of the loop as well as my starting stitch, and I'm now on my next set going to finish off my thread with my 3 stitches. So that, if you find as we turn the moccasin out the right way, sometimes there can be a rogue stitch kind of hanging on the outside, and you might not have realized that it's stitched that way. So what we're then going to do is to turn the moccasin inside out once we've identified where it is and we've stuck a needle through, so we know where our stitch is that needs sorting out. We can basically cut that one out, but use that technique of starting and finishing a couple of stitches either side of it, stitch it over, make it nice and sort of smooth, cut off the loop and cut out that rogue stitch, and then we're ready to go. Now the next thing to do is to just have a look, and at this point you want to be checking for bits and pieces of fluff. So now is a good time to just run round with the eye of the needle, and you're just gonna use it to just rough up any fur around the stitches. Make sure that nothing has got caught, make sure there aren't any other loops poking out and things where you might sort of want to just sort of check the stitching. You can also pop a finger in and just run it around the inside of the seam, and obviously you'll know then, if you can see your finger, that there is an issue that you need to sort of resolve before you turn your moccasin out the right way. So I'm just using the eye of the needle just to tease out any fur that might have got caught up, and it's actually coming out quite nicely, so there's quite a bit there. So I think apart from my loop that I've just dealt with, I think everything else has settled quite nicely. I'm also just using a low tack tape, and I'm just sort of dabbing it over. I want to sort of get rid of any little bits, any last bits of fluff, because once I've turned the moccasin the right way out, I only really want to turn it inside out again if there's a problem stitch to be dealt with. Otherwise I want it to actually be really nice, fluff free, and then ready to turn out the right way. So I think we've got a pretty good job there, that we're ready to turn out. So now we've finished de-fluffing, I'm going to turn this out the right way, and we want to try and do that in the easiest way and the sort of least disruptive way to all the stitching possible. One thing to be really careful of when you are turning your moccasin out is how much stress and strain you are putting on this section. So that front V is very vulnerable to ripping, so whenever you are pushing your moccasin out, please just be careful that you are avoiding sort of pushing it through and actually sort of putting strain on that area, because that would start to weaken it. So just be really careful when you are doing that. So I'm actually sort of pushing the toe in on itself, and it's being quite resistant because the rubber sole is there, and I'm looking to sort of almost sort of roll it in on itself, just to then get it out the right way. So I'm sort of having to be quite forceful along with the stitching, although it's very cleverly popping out. There we go. So we're underway. So I've now pinched the toe with my hand that's inside the moccasin, and I'm just sort of starting to roll it back on itself really carefully, so that I can then push it out the right way. And this is why you need a flexible glue and a flexible sole. There we go. So again, I'm now going to sort of just have a little bit of a check. If there's any rogue stitches, I'm going to have words with them, and I'm just sort of finger rolling the seams out. Now those of you that do quite a lot of leather work will also know that you can hammer your stitches to help to settle them. I would say yes, you can do that with your moccasin, but I would also add a word of caution. Now with this method we haven't used a welt, so you will see a couple of the stitches. When I talked earlier about dealing with the rogue stitches, it's generally, they're really obvious. You sort of see them, they'll stand out, and we want to not have them there. So they're the ones that we would be looking to just sort of clip out and make sure they re-stitch. Now as I'm turning it out, I'm also having another check of the sole, and I can see there's a couple of areas where I'm just going to add a little bit more glue once I've finished, so that I can make sure that that's really well stuck down. And I'll also do a final kind of clean up with the fur. So now we've rolled out, now we're going to talk about hammering. And when you hammer, you have to be very careful, particularly with your moccasins. Now if you've got anything like a cobbler's last, that can be really useful, and we just want to gently hammer the seam. So I'm going to be sort of manipulating the moccasin around my cobbler's last, but I'm also going to be using a little bit of a barrier because I don't want to damage anything that I've got that I've stitched. So it sort of involves a little bit of sort of clever manipulation. If you haven't got a cobbler's last, something like a hammer, where you can basically just get and just sort of gently hammer the seam. Now I'm using a barrier. The reason I didn't do it before turning it inside out is that you can push the stitched area, push the seam onto the outside of the leather, which can mark it. So that's why I haven't done it on the actual whilst it was inside out, and I speak from experience on that one. So I'm just using the hammer just very, very gently, and it's going to require a little bit of sort of creative movement to get into the areas around that toe section, but we'll wiggle and we'll get there. So we're just going to work our way around and just hammer the toe, there we go, just to help settle the stitches. So it's a bit hit and miss. I forgot my barrier then, you'll notice that. But I'm using one hand to sort of pull the moccasin onto the last so I can get some purchase underneath. Oh, there we go. And I'm just going to repeat that. I'm going to do the heel section as well. And then we're going to, well, you're probably ready to try it on, I know. But once you've hammered, now you've got sort of the option of wearing the heel up. You could also turn it down and sort of make it into quite a nice sort of cozy little slipper as well. And I think that's what I did with the other one. Now you could, if you found that coming out of your back seam it was just a little bit hairy, you can grab your scissors and just give that a little bit of a trim. And I'm just using my thread scissors here and just sort of trimming up the edge there. And that just kind of gets rid of any excess. So check your hammering, check your stitches, make sure there's no holes. And if you find that when you put your slipper on, you may find that this particular style, and it should be, quite cozy, quite sort of tight on the foot. With time this will become a little bit looser, and what you can do is almost add a lace that would then go around the back of the ankle. Now you could either sort of punch little holes and thread it through, or you might find that just putting a lace sort of towards the sort of the top of the V shape and then tying that when you've got the moccasin on would just be enough to hold it in position. And here we have our finished pair of moccasins. So they are made to measure. We've added a rubber sole, and we have got a really sort of nice shape and a style that's going to be really cozy on winter evenings. So happy wearing, everyone. Happy wearing, and thank you very much for joining me for this tutorial.